Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to Hope this morning, particularly if you're new at Hope today. We really do hope that you're encouraged by being here and that it's helpful to you that you've been here. So we're in this series called I Pray That, and we're looking at these prayers from the Apostle Paul that are written in the New Testament. Today's going to be a little different. If you've been here the last few weeks, this one's going to feel different than the last few weeks. And I think in a moment you will see why. So here's our opening question. What do you do when there's nothing you can do? Now, I think some of you are quite literally thinking, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? When there's nothing I can do. In our culture, where formulas and solutions and answers are part of what practically makes us American, the idea that there's nothing I can do is really foreign. So when I say, what do you do when there's nothing you can do? It's almost like I just said something in a really strange foreign language. And we're all trying to figure out, what does it mean, what he just said? So one more try, you know the old louder and slower? What do you do when there's nothing you can do? Okay, so I know. Like, I'm a solution guy. I'm a guy who is looking for the answers, be they science or knowledge or research or education. So I'm a guy who wants to try to find what the solutions are when life presents challenges and difficulties. And my guess is that most of us are probably like that. But what about when something has gotten to a place, a situation that's really hard, it's big, it's significant in our lives, and we cannot solve it, and we cannot fix it, and we cannot cure it? This is a real struggle in our culture. We live in a culture that emphasizes strength, that emphasizes solutions, having answers, that there are formulas, that with enough education, enough science, enough artificial intelligence, we'll be able to solve anything. So you may be thinking, okay, but just one question. Like, when you say, what do you do when there's nothing you can do? You don't mean that I haven't tried anything, right? No, I don't mean you haven't tried anything. I mean everything that we can try, we've tried. Every possible thing that is available to us, every lever we can pull, every dollar we can spend, every expert we can talk to, every resource or relationship or access to power, we've done all that. We've done all of that. Of course, any of us would do that. But what about when we've done all of that and we can't solve it? What do we do when there's nothing that we can do? We're now in a position of weakness. I think it's the word that we have to use, and it's a terrifying word in America. We're now in a position of weakness. I am not strong enough, or my resources or whatever levers I can pull are not enough for me to be able to solve or fix this problem. All right, I'm just being really transparent. Some of you are thinking, I've never had that experience. And in many ways, I'm super happy for you. If you're like, I've never had an experience where I couldn't solve it, fix it, or make it go away by whatever combination of my resources. But I would suggest that somewhere in our lives, all of us are going to face a situation like this. Probably plural. There'll probably be more than one. And learning how to navigate life when we come to a time like this seems to me to be pretty significant. But weakness, we're like, don't talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. Some of us are even afraid it's contagious. Like, somebody's in a position of weakness and I don't want to talk about it, or I don't want to be close to them because I might find myself in a similar position. Most of us are going to find ourselves in a position of weakness at some time in our lives. What kind of a situation? They're legion. A relationship that has broken and we have done everything we can possibly do and it's not coming back together. Not only is it not coming back together, but it's left unreconciled, and every effort to try to bring reconciliation and try to give it closure, even that's not happening. Now, we should try to reconcile, but there are times in life where, however complex the situation is, it doesn't happen that way. We desperately, even if we can't have the relationship healed, we would like it clear and reconciled. We'd like to put it in a box with a bow on it and at least put it on a shelf where we can say, okay, at least it's reconciled. But there are some situations in life where even that won't happen. Maybe it's a medical diagnosis and everything has been done that can be done. It's painful. Everything in us is opposed to this idea. Doctors know this. There are times when a doctor has to say, we have done everything that we can do. Maybe you have someone in your family who's struggling with addiction, and you have done everything. There isn't anything left undone. And this situation is not being fixed. As deeply as our hearts are breaking, and as much as we love the person and want health and healing and wholeness for them, it's not happening. So what do we do when there's nothing that we can do? So the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians, I'd say chapters 9 through 12, variously, he lays out what I would call his theology of weakness. He lists all the hardships and difficulties and pain in his life, and then we begin to see how he navigates all of this. And it comes to a certain place here in 2 Corinthians 12 where we get a window of it. He's speaking about boasting. He says, if I wanted to boast, I'd be no fool in doing so because I'd be telling the truth. Okay, how about that? But I won't do it because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. Boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. This is a guy who has discovered some depths of life that are really deep, and he's calling us to this place as well. So notice that he says, I begged the Lord 3 times to take away this thorn in my flesh. That's effectively the prayer that we're looking at today. You're thinking, I thought this was about the prayers of Paul. It is. He begged God 3 times. That's praying. That's begging praying. That's pleading praying. That's on your knees, upset, anxious, sad, worried, scared, at the end of your resources and rope praying. So he prays 3 times that God would remove this thorn in his flesh. Of course, we all want to know, what was it? What is this thing that he's calling the thorn in his flesh? There is so much ink spilled and so many books written on the speculations about what this thorn in the flesh is, and there's no really consummate answer. Theologians and scholars speculate, and it's all across the board. Some people think it was depression. Some people think it was chronic migraines. Some people think it was a particular person in his life. There's no clear answer. And I actually think we're fortunate that there's no clear answer. If the scriptures are inspired by the Spirit of God, I think there's a reason that this isn't named specifically. Because if it was named specifically and you didn't have that problem, you would just say, oh, I don't struggle with that. Next page. And you'd move on. And this whole thing about a theology of weakness that is a massive part of life, we would just gloss over it because we'd say, oh, well, that problem he's got, it's not my problem, so I'm moving on. The thorn in the flesh, you could say, stands for whatever is that thing, that situation, that hardship that I cannot solve. And it is very, very painful, maybe very fearful, maybe very scary, maybe very unsettling. We're not talking about the light level stuff of life here. We're talking about the deep level stuff of life here. Okay, so when he says, I begged 3 different times that God would take it away from me, each time God said, my grace is all you need. Now, most of us would say, no, your grace is not all I need. A solution to this horrible difficulty is what I need. As though God didn't know about these complex and difficult and hard places of life. And so God's answer to Paul in this great difficulty, whatever this thorn in the flesh is my grace is all you need. What does that mean? Well, his grace is what opens the door to a relationship with him, an intimate, deep relationship where we are living our lives in this deep place of intimate devotion with him. I think you could connect the dots and effectively understand that God is saying, I am sufficient for you. I am sufficient for you. Okay, so we've all been hearing a lot about this Latin phrase, quid pro quo. It's in the air a lot these days. And you know that this phrase means this for that. In other words, I do this with the expectation that in doing this, then you're going to respond by doing that. A little more street version would be, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That this is going to be some kind of unspoken agreement, right? I do this, you do that. Okay, whatever your thoughts about Washington, I am pretty sure that the most extensive quid pro quo in America is American Christianity. Whether we're actually saying it or not, or embracing it or not, for many of us, this whole thing, this whole Christian thing that we call with God, it's a massive quid pro quo arrangement. God, I do this, so you do that. This is the way it works, God, right? And you could fill in that formula with any personal words that apply to you. But the general term would be something like, God, I'm a good guy, so you make my life go nicely. God, I go to church, so you give me life according to the happy vision that I have. Whether we actually know it or not, I think it's helpful to name it, that for many of us, quid pro quo is the MO of the way we do this life with God. And the Bible, and particularly the Apostle Paul, is trying to teach us that there's something much deeper, much more beautiful, much more enduring through life's deepest difficulties than that. So the Apostle Paul says, if I boast, I'll boast in my weaknesses. I personally, aside from Paul, have never met anybody who boasted in their weaknesses. I've never been in a social setting or met somebody or developed a relationship where they said, let me tell you about my weaknesses. I'd love to tell you about my weaknesses. We don't do that. We tell about our strengths. We tell about our victories. We tell about our conquests. So here the Apostle Paul is referring to Jeremiah chapter 9. When he's using this boasting language, he's referring back to the prophet Jeremiah chapter 9. And this is what Jeremiah says. This is what the Lord says, don't let the wise boast in their wisdom, or the powerful boast in their power, or the rich boast in their riches. That's the stuff we normally boast about. He says, but those who wish to boast should boast in this alone, that they truly know me and understand that I am the Lord who demonstrates unfailing love and who brings justice and righteousness to the earth, and that I delight in these things. So most of us have been taught by the time we're adults, don't boast out loud. Keep it to yourself. Keep winding those wheels internally. But those internal messages are going to seep out one way or another. So what do we normally boast about? Jeremiah is naming them in the year about 700 BC. We tend to boast in our wisdom, our knowledge, our intellect. We tend to boast in our power or boast in our wealth. But he says, those who wish to boast should boast in this alone, that they truly know me and understand that I am the Lord who demonstrates unfailing love, who brings justice. You understand the irony of this, right? He says, let him who boasts boast in this, that they understand and know me. Well, the person who understands and knows God would never boast about it. This is the irony in this word from Jeremiah. The person who really knows God, the God we're talking about here, this humble, glorious God, the Father of Jesus Christ, the person who really knows that God would never boast about it, because boasting is so contrary to the character of this God I'm saying that I know so intimately. Okay, so weakness then is going to be our greatest opportunity for a deepening life with God. We're talking about a big move from a quid pro quo Christianity to an intimate relationship with God Christianity. We're talking about a big move here. Because when you come to a situation in life that's too big for you, what do you do when there's nothing left for you to do? There's nothing more you can do. One of two things is going to happen. We are either going to go toward bitterness or belovedness. And I'll explain that a bit. You've heard me say before, one of my favorites is a guy named Henry Nouwen, written a ton of books. One of them is called The Life of the Beloved, which is a source for a certain amount of today. And whenever we face something this big, we're either going to arc toward bitterness or belovedness. And much of it will be forged out through this journey, or it will simply reveal the view that I've got of life. The more our sense of God is a quid pro quo, the more bitterness is likely to be the result of a situation like this. Because the way it plays out is, God, I do this, you do that. I'm a good guy, you give me a good, happy life. And if I've got a situation that's too big for me and it appears that God's not giving me a good, happy life, then bitterness is the only result. That's where I go with it. I will either chuck the faith, or I'll do something polite on the exterior and look like I'm doing it when internally I've chucked it. It'll either be bitterness or belovedness. You see, it's these hard times of life where we hit forks in the road and we have opportunities to come to know God in ways we never did before. But those forks in the road are significant forks, and we will either go down bitterness or belovedness. You may know the story of Job in the Old Testament. Job is a man who experienced one after another of profound suffering experiences. He survived it. He protested with God. He told God he was angry. He told him he was upset. He had friends who came to him with foolish religious formulas. The reason this is happening, Job, is because you this, that, and the other thing. None of them were accurate, but that's what people do. And so Job goes through all of these experiences of hardship. And at the end, when we come to Job chapter 42, in a conversation where Job comes back to God, after all that he's experienced and all this hardship, this is what he said to God. He said, I had only heard about you before, but now I've seen you with my own eyes. Before all this hardship in my life, God, I had all the religious answers. I knew all the stuff. I'd heard plenty about you. I could have taught other people about you. But now that I've been through these places where I was in positions of weakness and I couldn't solve it or fix it, I've realized that now I see you. Now I know you. But you know that Job came to the intersection between bitterness and belovedness, and he wrestled through it. It wasn't simplistic. It was deep. He wrestles and he tells God he's upset and he's angry and he feels like he's getting a raw deal. The beauty of it is the honesty of it, and when he keeps working through it, he moves out of bitterness and into belovedness. So what do you get when you don't get a solution? You get God. You get God. What God is telling Paul, when Paul says, I pleaded, I begged, oh God, take this away, please, please. The most earnest of begging, pleading prayer. And God didn't solve it. He didn't fix it, at least the way Paul pleaded with him to fix it. And what did God say to him? What I give you as answer to your prayer, Paul, is me. It's deep water. He says, my grace suffices, Paul, because my grace is the door to this intimate relationship with me. We're all inclined to do the quid pro quo thing, and God is calling us for a relationship of intimate love. So now it says in his book, any lover wants to know you enjoy me for who I am and not just for what I can do for you. And God is a lover. God is a lover. And he's made us in his image. So he wants to know that we enjoy him for who he is and not just for what we think he can do for us. And we are the same way with people. We protest when we face weakness over which we have no control, or at least we learn that we had far less control than we thought. Believing that we do have control or tools or formulas, when they don't work, blame is then required rather than mystery and worship. It's understandable. So when we try believing that we can control and should be able to fix something and we find that we can't, there's this gap, and what we will do next is fill the gap with blame. It's the only logical solution. And so we will blame God or others or ourselves, and that blame fulfills some aspect of a formula providing an explanation of fault rather than an intimacy with God and a deepening trust. And this is what God is saying to Paul. Paul, what's available to you is an intimacy with me beyond anything you've ever known before. But we hit this fork in the road, and we're either going to choose bitterness or belovedness. The result of this blame to fill the formula is the diminishment of love and devotion, blaming God, blaming others, blaming ourselves. And the bitterness of blame makes our flesh feel better, but it shrinks and withers our souls. So when we talk about weakness, this terrifies us. I have the same feelings. But here's what I am pretty sure now. One of the most important things we will ever do in life is develop our own theology of weakness. What will I do when something comes along that is bigger than me, bigger than my resources, bigger than every lever I have available to pull? What will I do? It's a really important thing for us to learn, because without any sense of engaging this, we will either go toward bitterness, which is probable, or belovedness if we can walk this journey as Paul's explaining it. One of the most important things we'll do is develop a theology of weakness, a robust depth with God in these situations, or a bitterness. So it's an interesting question, right? Because the Apostle Paul says, so I boast in my weaknesses. We're raised in the air of the American culture, right? We're like, please, keep weakness away from me, please. But life will bring a situation or situations to us somewhere where it's bigger than we are, and we don't have the resources to solve it. What will we do? We will blame and move toward bitterness, or we will move toward belovedness. So here's an interesting question. We so desperately want to be strong in life. We want to feel that we can do anything, overcome anything. This is part of American culture as well. And there are certain things about it that I really appreciate. Like, come on, we can do it. And there's a lot of good in that. But there's also a realistic understanding that there are some things that are bigger than we are. Most of us were raised as children with a phrase that went something like this: whatever you believe, you can achieve. Whatever you dream, you can do, if you're willing to work hard enough at it. Here's the challenge. It's not true. Now, I'm not discarding the concept in its entirety. It's beautiful to dream and to go for it. It's like essential. It's full of hope, and it's wonderful and good and right. But if we think we can do anything that our minds comprehend, it's not true. Let's lighten it up a little bit for a moment. No matter how much I dream, no matter how hard I worked, I would never play in the NBA. It's just not going to happen. I am not fast enough, not athletic enough, not coordinated enough. I can't jump. It's not going to happen. If I was told, David, if you work at it hard enough, you'll be able to play in the NBA, it's not true. I do not have the skill level that you have to play in the NBA. So what do we do when we face these realities? It's either bitterness or belovedness. So who is strong and who is weak? Well, we want so badly to appear to be strong, but are we strong if we're terrified of being weak? What about the person who has navigated some of life's most difficult places and has developed a robust theology of weakness that leads them toward a beloved intimacy with God? And yes, of course, they would say these hard times, they are really hard. I'm not saying they're not hard. They're really hard. But you can do it. I can do it. You've done it before, and you can do it if you face these hard times again. It is time to move deep, deep, deep into the heart of God, particularly in these times of life. So who's the person who's weak? The person who appears so strong, but who's really terrified of being weak? Or the person who may not appear so strong, but who, when faced with weakness, has the way of knowing the depths of intimacy with God to be able to move through these hardest experiences of life? I think that's the strong person. And that's why Paul says, so I boast about my weaknesses. In 2 Timothy, when Paul was writing to his protege Timothy, he speaks about his suffering. He says, that's why I'm suffering as I am, yet this is no cause for shame, because I know whom I have believed, and I'm convinced that he's able to guard what I've entrusted to him until that day. Do you notice the shift? He doesn't say, I know what I believe. He says, I know whom I've believed. That's another one of these massive shifts from what I believe to whom. This is a relational religion we're talking about, and the call of God's heart is to this beloved intimacy with him. And so he doesn't say, I know what I've believed, and that's keeping my life together. He says, I know whom I've believed. So bitterness or belovedness. Now and again says, when we have come to believe in the voices that call us worthless or unlovable, then success, popularity, and power are easily perceived as attractive solutions. In other words, if I'm believing that I'm not beloved, then I'm going to pursue those efforts at that kind of identity through success and popularity and power. But of course, those are mirages for belovedness. He says, our opportunity is to change from living life as a painful test to prove that you deserve to be loved, to living it as an unceasing yes to the truth of that belovedness. So Henry Nouwen was a big deal theologian, and he worked in all the great universities and blah, 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 and he got tired of it. And so he decided in his career he was going to move to be the chaplain of a home for disabled adults. This place is in Toronto called La Arche. And Henry, who had been in all the ivory towers of acclaim, was now in a home that had about a dozen residents who were disabled adults, varying degrees, Down syndrome, or other types of challenges. And Nouwen talks about an afternoon when he was leading communion, and 12 residents of the house were there to receive communion. And he was offering communion in a beautiful, personal way, and as each person came forward, he would place his hands on their shoulders and he would look them in the eye. And he would say, you are a beloved son or a beloved daughter of God. And as you receive these elements, know that this God loves you with an everlasting love. Nouwen says one of the things that he learned by spending years at large caring for people with disabilities, he said, I noticed that so many of these people with these disabilities chose gratitude over bitterness. And it became a profound message to me who didn't have these disabilities. In fact, who had all of those things the world acclaims. So one afternoon, he's doing this communion, and one by one, the residents are coming forward. He places his hands on their shoulders and blesses them. And he notices in the back of the room, there's a young man who works there. He's not disabled. He's one of the caregivers there. He's in his mid-20s. And Henry looks in the back of the room, and he crosses eyes with this young man. And after all 12 of the residents had been through for communion, Henry stands there, and this young man walks from the back. And he looks at him and he says, Henry, I would like this blessing too. So Henry puts his hands on his shoulders, and the 12 residents are standing there watching Henry put his hands on this young man, John's shoulders. And he says to John, "John, it is good that you are here. You are a beloved son of God. Your presence is a joy for all of us. When life feels overwhelming, remember that you are loved by God's everlasting love." John started crying. 12 residents there, seeing John, their caregiver, receive communion, are crying, and John receives this communion. The journey of weakness is one of the most sacred journeys we'll ever experience in our lives. So it was about 2007 when in our family we noticed that my dad was no longer really thinking in the right sort of lanes and categories. It wasn't so much forgetfulness. I mean, we've all got a certain amount of that. But the thinking was discombobulated. The channels were crossing, and this began the long road into Dad's Alzheimer's. We did all that you can do, but we know that there's not a cure for Alzheimer's. It's a challenging journey to watch somebody who's been a tower of strength for you all your life descend into a journey of weakness. And so my family's had this wonderful place down in Georgia that's been in our family for generations, where we have the privilege of vacationing. And Dad was several years into Alzheimer's, and my sister and I said to our mom, "Hey, Mom, let's make one more trip down there with Dad." And she said, "I don't think so. I don't think he can make the trip." And we said, "Why? What are you concerned about?" And she said, "Well, if we do the trip, he can't have any of his caregivers go, and I don't think he's going to be up for the trip." And we said, "Is it Dad who's not up for the trip, Mom, or is it you who's not up for the trip?" So she called our bluff. She said, "If you two will become Dad's caregivers and do anything that he needs while we're there, let me think about it." So we said, okay. So my sister and I talked a little bit about how to fill that need. So lo and behold, we ended up taking the trip together. I know that many of you have experienced things like this. So one afternoon, my mom said, "David, you're going to need to help Dad shower this afternoon." And I said, okay. I said, "Do you have any tips for me?" She said, "My tip is be patient. It's going to take a long time." I said, okay. So I helped Dad, and we went into this bathroom, and it had a chair where he could sit, and I helped him get undressed. And as we were entering this experience, it's as though something palpable filled the room. It was as though the place had become a sanctuary of holy beauty. And so here, of course, the roles are completely reversed. My dad, who is mentally and physically now very weak, and here I am in the position of strength trying to help him. The whole time I kept thinking to myself, David, if you were Dad, how would you want to be treated right now? It takes like 10 minutes to take off the socks, not to mention pants, underwear, etc. So we got ready for Dad to get in the shower. It was a standing stall shower. It did have a bar in it that he could hold on to, which was great. And as we turned the water on and we were talking about how to do this, I realized that I was going to get pretty wet, so I had to take my shirt off because most of the top half of me is going to be in there in the shower as well. And as the water came down warm, and I said, "Dad, why don't you turn so the water comes on your back?" And he held on to the bar, and I would wash his back. And all I know to say is that something just breathtakingly beautiful was happening. And Dad was in a position of abject weakness. So we talked a little bit about, I encouraged him of how he could take care of the most private personal parts. And then after the shower was over, I dried him off and combed his hair and helped him sit and put his clothes back on. And it was about an hour and a half when we emerged from the bathroom. So that night after dinner, my dad had gone to bed, and my mom said to me, "What did you do in the shower with Dad?" And I don't know why I felt nervous, like, is this some kind of an accusation? Like, I said, "What do you mean, what did I do in the shower with Dad?" And she said, "Dad said something beautiful happened in there." And I said, "Mom, something beautiful did happen in there." She said, "Well, how do you explain it?" And I said, "I don't think I have an explanation for it, Mom." I said, "But there was something remarkable in the place of his weakness." And she said, "Well, what did you do when you gave him a shower?" I said, "I just tried to keep thinking, David, if you were Dad, how would you want to be treated right now?" for many of us to come to real love, we have to be healed. And sometimes it's only brokenness that will enable this healing. And this is a risky healing because we will experience brokenness as either being broken open or broken apart. Broken open to deep love, broken apart to disillusionment and bitterness and anger. What do you do when there's nothing you can do? There's bitterness or there's belovedness. And God's most beautiful invitation is into his belovedness. Let's pray. God, would you help us to find our way in the holy places as you whisper to us about these hard times in life? And Lord, would you help us to move out of the quid pro quo and into intimacy with you? And would you help us help each other as we journey as a church together through the hard times of life? And help us love you and hear your voice of love over us, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Once again, I invite